Let's spend a little time looking at other controls that are available to you as part of building Metro-style applications. The list view control is a control that presents a collection of items in a list that can scroll vertically. An example might look something like this, where we have a list of images, a couple bits of text, in a list that scrolls vertically but not horizontally. A grid view control, on the other hand, is a control that presents a collection of items in rows and columns that can also scroll horizontally. And it might look something like this, with possibly multiple rows and multiple columns with the ability to scroll left and right as well. These two controls are very similar in their use and construction. In each case, you'll want to specify an item's source property. And generally that happens in the constructor for the class containing your page. This allows you to specify where the data is coming from. You'll need to specify an item template. This describes how each item in the list view or grid view should appear. You'll also want to specify an item container style, which describes the behavior for the container for each item. For the grid view, you can also specify an items panel. This describes the layout of the items as a collection within the grid. You'll often want to handle the click event of an item in the list view or grid view. In this case, you'll handle the item click event. The event argument of type item click event args receives a clicked item property that allows you to retrieve information about the item that was clicked. Let's look at the list view and grid view examples that you saw on the previous slides. I've loaded Microsoft's simple list view and grid view essentials example, which allows us to both work with a grid view and a list view control. Here I've instantiated a grid view, and as you can see, we get 3 rows of data which I can scroll through. And although the screen isn't quite wide enough, you can see that their default width is a little wider than our screen, and we can scroll left and right in this grid view. I can also click on items. If I click on an item, you can see we get an event handler running, which indicates which item we've currently selected. Finally, we can instantiate a list view here, and we can scroll vertically through these. And again, there's not quite enough screen real estate to show the full item. Oh, there it is. And we can see the entire list view here. So that's the entire example. Let's look at the code to see how it's working. Back in Visual Studio, I'll need to stop running. And once we do, you can see there are 3 scenario outputs, and those are the pages we care about. Let's look at scenario 1 output. This one contains a grid view. There's our grid view, and you can see it here. The grid view's name is item grid view. Its background is white. It has an item template, which is the storefront tile template, which isn't here in this page, so it must exist somewhere else. Let's look around and see if we can find some styles somewhere. Let's look at app.xaml, and I seem to see a bunch of resources here that include some styles. And if we go back to scenario 1 output, we're looking for storefront tile template. Let's go back here and look for it. Storefront, there we are. So this is a data template, and that's how you define how things look within a grid view. A data template element allows you to specify markup that defines exactly what shows up within each item of the grid view. Well, each item will be a little grid with its horizontal alignment set to left and its background set to white, and the grid contains a stack panel. I'm not sure why it needs to be a grid if it's containing a stack panel, but we'll let that go since it only has 1 cell in it. In any case, we have a stack panel whose orientation is horizontal, and we have an image and another stack panel within this stack panel. The other stack panel's orientation is vertical, and it has 2 text blocks. If you'll remember, our grid view showed an image and 2 pieces of text. The first piece of text was the title, and the second piece of text was a subtitle. You can see we have styles that define that behavior, and somewhere, here we go, it should say where the text property is coming from, and it's bound to the title property of whatever data is filling the grid view. Now we'll have to go back to the page to see how that's happening. But in any case, you can see that this data template defines how each item within the grid appears. All right, what else do we have? We have item container style, and that's storefront tile style. Let's go look for that. Storefront tile style, and this is just a standard style that defines how each item within the grid view should be formatted. It displays a font, a foreground color, a height, a width, and all that sort of thing. This is the physical attributes of the container for each tile in the grid view, and this data template defines what fits into that tile. Back at our grid, we have an items panel, and this defines the entire panel for the items. That is, all of them as a group. And we'll have storefront grid items panel template. Can I remember all that? No. So I'll copy it to the clipboard, go to app.xaml, and look for it. There we are. And you can see that this items panel template, which defines how things will look within the grid, is a wrap grid control. A wrap grid is a grid that wraps from top to bottom, and we specify the maximum number of rows or columns, because the wrap grid can wrap across rows or across columns. This one, since it is vertical children alignment is top, horizontal children alignment is left, defines that we're going from one row to the next, and we get exactly or up to 3 rows of data. Back in our grid view definition, we have a border brush, a vertical alignment, a border thickness. We have properties that define whether we see the vertical scroll bar or the horizontal scroll bar, and we also have the selection mode, which by the way is set to none, which means we can't ever select an item in this grid view. If I drop the list down, you'll see we can choose none, single, multiple, which means I can just click on multiple items, or extended, which means I can use the shift click and control click to select multiple items. We had it set to none originally. Well, this doesn't tell us where the data is coming from. So let's look in the code for scenario output 1.xaml and see if it tells us where the data is coming from. Here in the constructor, you can see we create a new instance of the stored data class and then set the collection property of that stored data to be the item source property of the grid view. Well, we better find stored data. Where would that be? Well, could it be here under sample data sources? There's store data. And you can see that store data has a bunch of stuff in it that defines a collection property where we add individual items, where each item is an instance of this item class. Well, what's an item? Let's go look. An item has a title property, a subtitle property, an image property. It has a method to set the image. It's got a link property, a category property, a description property, and so on. Anyway, each one represents an item in this list that will display in this collection called store data. It has a property called collection that it returns, and we bind to that data. Let's look at the next scenario then. Let me close this down. Let's clean up here a little. Here's scenario output 2. This one allows us to click an item and display it on the screen. This one has a grid view set up much like the last one. The real difference here is we should be able to click on things. There is item click enabled is set to true, so that allows us to select things. Now, I would have expected that the selection mode would also be set, but is item click enabled must be enough to allow us to select one item at a time. My guess is the selection mode of single is the default, so we're not specifying it here. But in any case, it's the item click event handler we need to go to when someone clicks an item in the grid view, and let's navigate to this event handler. And here's the event handler. We want to take the clicked item, which is a property of the event args that were handed, and cast it as an item. You remember item, we saw it already, it's got a bunch of properties, and we can retrieve from that item the category and the title. And we'll see that information displayed. Now, notify user is a procedure in this sample which just displays its content within a text block on the page. The important part is we retrieve the clicked item property, cast it as the correct kind of thing, and then retrieve properties of it and display them in our output. Let's look at scenario output 3. This one displays a list view, and it's basically the same concept. Most of the properties are the same. We have a list view with a name, a width, and a height, horizontal alignment, background. We have an item template, an item container style. What we don't have is that other option, which, as you'll recall, let's go back and look here, was the items template. Where did that go? I need scenario output 1. Here we are. We don't have the items panel. That's the one we're missing. Items panel doesn't apply to a list view because in a list view, you just have a single vertical column of data. Let's go back to scenario output 3. Here we are. And everything else is pretty much the same as with a grid view. If we look at the code for this, we should also see the same sort of initialization. We create a stored data instance and then take the collection property of that stored data and set it as the item source property of our list view. Given that code, we've bound our list view to data that's coming from that stored data class, which could get its data by calling a web service or retrieving it from a database, who knows. It's static data in this example, but that's not the point. The point is to show binding the data to the list view. We've seen a few very simple examples of working with a list view and a grid view. Next, we'll look at a more complex control.